We're looking at the intersection today between what is considered classical Tantra, a worldview that says your embodiment is sacred and that your only job is to fully experience and enjoy your human embodiment and reflect it back to divinity so that your unique experience is magnified and reflected back to the whole. And Neo-Tantra, which takes a component of overall Tantra, which is to really blow out, expand, and enjoy and embody your sexuality in a way that honors the divine, and then somatic psychology, or the psychology that is based on the body. Well, hello everybody. It's Christine Marie Mason, your host for the Rose Woman podcast, where every episode we try to bring a little bit more freedom, spaciousness, liberation into some idea that might have been holding us in a prison of our own making or of the culture's making. We used to call it from taboo to liberation. We've been expanding a lot, talking more about neuroscience, neurobiology, cultural biology, sociology. But today we are talking again about sexuality, intimacy, and relationship, and we're focusing on Tantra. Tantra is such a huge, broad range of topics, and today my guest is Lauren Searles. I met Lauren as part of the project on the Big Island of Hawaii that I've been involved with for some time. I started it 6 years ago with my business partner, John Shiva, and we crafted this beautiful garden space, and it's gone through several iterations, eco-village, community, just a retreat center, and right now we have a really wonderful cohort of residents, beautiful farm, everything's off-grid, and I always am intrigued by the people who land there. Currently, there are quite a few people who had very stringent religious upbringings and have been unwinding some of those stories to find more freedom, to find their bodies as nature. And they've come so far. They dance, they do yoga, they sing together. They're in a very devotional space, but without the dogma and shame that they grew up with. And that wasn't intentional. They just sort of found their way there, which I love to know. There's also a good cohort of people who are exploring topics around sexuality and who have made that their life's work or part of their life's work. And one of those people is Lauren. There are so many amazing stories from that project that I thought about creating a whole series called Tantra Island and writing about the funny and weird stuff that goes at the intersection of living off-grid and for a bunch of city people to try to figure out how to do that, and the personality things that come up and the learnings that come up when you try to put a bunch of adults from a lot of different backgrounds into one place. It's definitely like a reality show. But it's their real lives. It's our real lives. And so I guess not funny, not really the subject for fiction. Anyway, today, Lauren and I go deep into Tantra, and I start by asking her for some definitions. Can we just define what is Tantra, what is Neo-Tantra, just so that people have basics?
Yeah, so I studied non-dual Shaiva Tantra and Shakta Tantra. So those schools of thought are based in India, and they come from a yogic tradition where they kind of branched off, and they are, in a sense, enveloping a tradition. And so you would be initiated. And so there is a guru lineage, and that really separates them from Neo-Tantra, which there's no true lineage. Neo-Tantra is not really a path to enlightenment, whereas Tantra is using mantra and different kinds of entrainments, mudra, in order to liberate. And so what I also think is important about Tantra is this embrace of the whole body, and this embrace of the body as divine, and that there's no separation between us and the divine. And so there's nothing that we can practice that, you know, would be like sinful or something like that, or bad or naughty, but it wasn't necessarily a sexual practice. And I think Neo-Tantra kind of took this idea that, oh, everything is divine, and, you know, there are sexual practices in Tantra, but it's not the whole practice. Sacred sexuality, or Neo-Tantra, is this deep inquiry of how intimate can I be with myself, or how can I use sexuality as healing and as like a healing force?
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand from those Shaivist Tantra people, is that it would be things like, could you eat meat and raw meat, and could you strip down and be naked? Could you cover yourself in ash? Could you approach the taboo cremation grounds? Could you drink from a skull? Could you do all the things that otherwise might separate you from divinity in all these traditional ways, and say, you know what, it's all holy because I can never be separate. And then if you take the little sexuality piece, it feels like the proportion to which it gets blown out is in proportion to how it was repressed or stigmatized in the culture. So it's quite possible that the Neo-Tantra component got amplified because the culture that it was coming into was being so repressive and sort of strange around sexuality.
Yeah, I like what you said. As part of a tantric practice was alchemizing the taboo. So they would take something that was quote unquote wrong in the Hindu tradition, and they would welcome it in and go, this is sacred too, and I'm going to alchemize this as part of my spiritual practice. And so it can be a really powerful practice, and also Tantra is said to be a kind of a dangerous path, or a lightning path, or a quickening path. And so I think that's where, for myself personally, the teachings of somatic psychology came in, and it was like, whoa, let's slow down a little bit. What is actually going on when we do these high force, high pranic practices? It's like we're speeding everything up, but we're not slowing down maybe to address what's actually being kicked up in the energy system. And so that's where I felt in my own path. I was like, found somatic psychology, and I need to hold my inner child. I have, unmet, unhealed parts of myself that Tantra wasn't fully addressing. And that's where I feel like this is a symbiotic relationship, and how they weave and can come together, and they don't need to be separate paths or dueling paths, like you'd have to choose one or the other. I think that they really, really fit in nicely with each other.
Yeah. As you're talking, I was thinking about sometimes when you've got something that you've repressed, you swing to the other side, like in an extreme way, and you sort of go, like hands on your hips, like, I can do that, I'm going to do it. And it's kind of an internal dare, but you're overriding this tender piece of you that like wants to be brought along, and so that you can integrate and actually feel it. So can you tell a little bit about how you grew up and how you came to this path?
I was really fortunate in that my parents left the Christian church when I was 6, and they divorced, which is unfortunate, but I didn't have that super strict religious indoctrination. And I feel really grateful in that my parents kind of just let me do whatever I want. And that also meant believe whatever I wanted. And so I had this, just curious mind, and started reading Abraham Hicks when I was 16. And I moved to San Francisco and got into sacred sexuality and sensual massage. And so I just kind of followed the threads. And then when sensual massage got kind of boring, I really wanted to study Tantra. And I was like, this must be it. This must be the way, or a part of the way. And so I immersed myself in Tantra and went to India and studied under Psalm Isadora, and had this wild ride with the Shakti path and Kali and Durga and all these, kind of goddess worshipping paths, like doing yoni pujas and breast massage. And so we were just really in this tight kula, and it was really beautiful. And then, I fell in love and I had this wild, beautiful love affair with a married man, and we were polyamorous, and it was glorious, and it was ugly, and it was tumultuous, and it was traumatizing, and it was everything. And so I was also meditating a lot at the same time, as part of my commitment to the Shaiva path. And I just found that I was just really sensitive, and my nervous system felt like it was on the edge of my skin, and I was easily triggered, and everything was sort of blown out of proportion, and it just didn't feel like it was nourishing me to the extent that I needed. And so eventually that relationship ended, and I by the grace of creatrix, I enrolled in this somatic coaching program. And so literally the day we broke up, I did my first self-love practice. And I had never done a self-love practice before. I had never learned to resource love from not another person. And so it was this huge transmission of like, oh, I can receive love from the divine or from myself and not from this human that I'm so attached to. And so it began this inner, I would say even deeper healing journey into my psyche and what was going on underneath the surface that was kind of causing these larger relationship schisms, right? Like our inner life creates our outer life in a way, right? Our stories and our nervous system and in the Tantra path, the samskaras, right, create our life and how we live it. So it became this really beautiful internal investigation and healing path. And that's kind of where I just became so fascinated in the world of somatics.
Can you talk a little bit about that self-love practice, the first one that you did? What is a self-love practice?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are very many of them. So I was certified through Layla Martin. And this practice first had us kind of lay down. I like to do the somatic practices laying down. And she had us first just drop in by observing our own sensations in our body. So it's, oh, my right hip kind of hurts. Oh, my neck, there's a tinge there. I have warmth in my belly. And so you're just tracking sensation. You're just dropping in. And then she would have us do maybe 20 conscious breaths just to open up the limbic system. So when we're kind of investigating what's going on underneath the surface, we actually want to access the limbic system and what's going on in there. And so after naming and observing sensations, we would do long, slow, connected breathing to access the limbic system. And that's where our old emotional imprints are stored and traumas and things that are just below our conscious mind. So it's a way to open that up and also feel it and resource. So once we're kind of in this, stirred up place, then there's some somatic movement. Maybe you're breathing into these places and sounding out the emotion. In the realm of somatic psychology and healing, we want to move these feelings all the way through. We want to feel them, but we also want to allow them to move. And so there can be literal movement of the body of shaking or kind of undulating or just, it's very organic. It's not supposed to be like a trained movement. It's just an organic, spontaneous movement. And so there can be sounding with those emotions and just really, there's something called, completing the trauma cycle. So if there was something there that you were afraid of, it's like, okay, maybe you need to shake. Maybe you need to move your legs, maybe you need to complete that. And then there's this phase after that where you welcome in divine energy and you welcome in the divine mother who is unconditionally loving and compassionate and connecting your heart with her heart and breathing in this unconditional love as you also exhale this unconditional love. And then we also do that with the divine father, feeling the divine masculine love. And that could be a fatherly love. It could be a tree. It could be a mountain. But however we want to relate with that. But then we're also, I need love from the father. I need to feel this divine support. And I really felt it pour in for the first time in that kind of meditative way that, again, wasn't coming from a person. And so it gave me that real somatic, sensational experience of feeling love that didn't come, quote unquote, outside of me.
Well, kind of like a more abstracted, generalized love of divinity or something like that. I was thinking about like a time when I was trying to relax my eyes, like the muscles behind my eyes, and release whatever was stored there. And it started to get painful. Like, how sometimes when you've been working something so long and it starts to soften, it's crampy. And that as I accessed a little bit more relaxation and sensation, like I got super resistant to going in any deeper. Do you have, is that part of the breath work? Like if you're guiding someone through a relaxation or a self-love practice, and can you see where they're still holding tightness or energy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important to work with someone's system where they're at. And I think also in trauma resolution therapy, you move slow, right? Wow. There's this beauty in slowness. And I think there's some deconditioning of the Western mind that faster is always better, or we can heal this in one session, or I have an agenda as a practitioner to like show this person how good of a healer I am. It's actually about attunement, right? So there can be a pause and a softening and allowing, and also curiosity of like, hey, what is going on with the tightness in the eye? What is the story behind it, right? And you just rolled your eyes. So there's something behind that, there's a story there. And so the body talks and speaks in sensation. And so when we slow down enough to feel it, then we are unraveling the story, and then we're becoming more free, right? We're becoming closer to our true essence, our true self. And so that's where I also see the beauty between Tantra, lineage Tantra, and somatic psychology, is they're actually both working together to bring out our essence.
Well, I love this. So in a way, you're identifying where the story sits in the body. You're letting it rest, relax, so that you can clear it out. Then you're replacing it with like a loving energy, which must make you ready to meet another person. So for someone who's never been in a puja, an ista environment, can you describe what goes on in one of those environments in a traditional neo-tantra container before we get into sort of personal practice?
In the neo-tantra movement, they really took this word puja, which means ritual. So I'm just going to say it's not really a traditional puja in any sense of the word, of how it was originally done in classical Tantra. But, we want to sanctify our experience. And we're saying, hey, as I relate to this person in front of me, we're both in the presence of the divine, and we're both willing to at least be curious to witness this person just in this moment. And so there's a lot of kind of partner work, and sometimes, standing in a circle, and there might be men on the outside of the circle and women on the inside. And then there's just these prompts of maybe taking a few deep breaths together and like regulating and communing. And then there might be some eye gazing practices, and there may be, some communication prompts of, getting them to relate on a deeper level. And the after effect is really feeling seen and really feeling other people, but also feeling them feeling you. And so there's this symbiotic connection and kind of group oxytocin experience where we all feel more connected to the whole in a very real, tangible, grounded way. That's really beautiful. And we don't have really context of that outside of these pujas. It's not like we were really trying to feel connected in school. We weren't like, wow, let's all hold each other's hearts and breathe. It was very much just mind-based and logical based and linear based. So I think it's a beautiful way of dropping out of the head and into the heart and the body, and just really being present with each other.
When I was married, I remember this feeling of like craving a deeper connection with my partner, with my husband, and not being able to get there. And like the sex was fine, and we laughed a lot. We had a good domestic relationship. And when I went to my first Tantra training, Neo-Tantra training, the trainers, Steve and Lakita Carter, who are in the lineage of Margot Anand's Sky Dancing Tantra, they did this super simple exercise where he sat facing her. They were cross-legged and maybe like 2 feet apart, like you and I are. And they created an imaginary bubble around themselves, and they invited in the qualities they wanted, and they put out the qualities they didn't, and they stated their ground rules, like I have 15 minutes for this interaction until I have to, go to a conference call. But they brought in things like love and kindness and all of that stuff. And then they looked at each other and they started with giving compliments. And then the person who called the little session got to say what they wanted to talk about. And the other person just listened to them as deeply as possible, as presently as possible, didn't crosstalk, didn't interrupt. And I watched this couple do it. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever seen a man and a woman connect around a moment of conflict in such a sacred and loving way. It had nothing to do with sex. It had everything to do with connection. And I was weeping by the end of it. Like, that was the signpost of the vulnerability and the presence that I'd hoped for. So that's my first experience. Some of the other things that that I was exposed to later, I got a little antsy about. I want to say, like, going into these circles with strangers and not knowing what the container was, and like there's a quality sometimes that I'm like, is it just a gimmick? It's like an imprint from when I was a teenager dealing with all the slut shaming of that culture at that time. Like, is this just a way to sanctify and make it okay, but it still has like an underbelly of not really feeling sacred? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to tease it out. Like, is it just like, somebody told me a funny joke one. It's like, come into my temple, goddess. And it's like the back of his van, like draped with Christmas lights and batik. Anyway, like, is it a seduction methodology, or is it true meeting? And how do you differentiate the two?
That is such a great inquiry. And I think a lot of it has to do with the culture that we're raised in. I wasn't raised in any kind of ritual or prayer. And so I think as Westerners, we're like really trying so hard to kind of adopt these rituals and make the mundane sacred. And sometimes we fail miserably and we don't really understand. And it's not maybe authentic. And I think that, in those spaces, those neo-tantra spaces and workshops and things, there can be a lot of assumptions made that everyone is a yes and everyone's ready and you're ready to have a yoni massage and, maybe stimulate a man's prostate. And there's not really a lot of warning or permission or trauma training and resolution. So they can be really dangerous places, and there can be predatory spaces, and they can be a place for tantra man to be like, welcome to my temple, goddess. And he can take advantage of women who are like, what's this energy, and I want to be with the divine. We have this yearning inside to merge with God, with Shiva. We're like, of course, but it's not coming from this really true authentic place. And so I think that's again where classical tantra comes back in. It's sit with the self, do training, go back to tradition, go back to the yoga mat and come back to the self. And so I think there could be maybe an over enunciation in neo-tantra with, these connection and outer practices, where I feel like tantra really brings it back into the inner self.
I mean, I want to just call out something you said, which is, we don't grow up in a culture of reverence and ritual. And so when we do it, we might get it wrong. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Mm-hmm. That the longing for the sacred is part of being alive in a body. So you might mess up. You can get over it. You're resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of feeling, what is this hidden message that wants to come through today? And it was one of play. Yeah. And it was like, okay, Lauren, I'm kind of studying my texts and my definitions, and I'm getting all heady. And then it was like, whoa, you're really forgetting about play. And I think play is such an essential need across just being a human, just humaning, and humaning well is this concept of divine play and curiosity and not getting it right and knowing that we're messy humans. And there's no, enlightened master that's not going to fuck up at some time, that isn't going to have transgressions or problems or issues, so it's like there is no concept of perfection.
Oh man, you're just like, now you're getting into some juicy questions. Okay, so I would just want to recap so far. So we're looking at the intersection today between what is considered classical Tantra, a worldview that says your embodiment is sacred and that your only job is to fully experience and enjoy your human embodiment and reflect it back to divinity, so that your unique experience is magnified and reflected back to the whole. And Neo-Tantra, which takes a component of overall Tantra, which is to really blow out, expand, and enjoy and embody your sexuality in a way that honors the divine. And then somatic psychology, or the psychology that is based on the body, and that your body knows. And that sort of this combination of the safety and exploring the body, finding containers in which to learn skills, to practice reverence, to practice sacredness, while always coming back to your own experience. How are those related? And now we're sort of crossing into this territory of finding the right places. And there's something that's been coming up recurrently over the last 4 or 5 years in particular around like, what is a woman, or a man for that matter, what is their responsibility, their self-responsibility in containers that have power dynamics with very charismatic leaders. And you just said everybody's going to mess up. So what's the boundary for someone to say, like, I take responsibility for getting up and leaving the room, or I'm in it, and if something goes wrong, I own that also, and I can also choose to leave the next time. I mean, that's just a place of exploration. Let's see what comes out.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think, as you know, I was a 24-year-old woman who went into some of these neo-tantra workshops just having no idea what's going on. I'm totally young, totally gullible. The teacher was charismatic and hot and older, and I slept with him, or he slept with me. And it was a kind of confusing experience, but I think...
Was this the guy you fell in love with?
No, definitely didn't fall in love with him. But, you know, he kind of founded this movement that I'm not necessarily going to name right now, but
that's very diplomatic.
Yeah, I mean, I could, but yeah, so it was this foundation, and it's still kind of flourishing and happening, where the teachers were allowed to sleep with students during the trainings, and it was almost kind of part of their
initiation.
Yeah. And so it became, I think, really sticky and really traumatizing. And then they also told the participants, you're 100% responsible for your experience, and they weren't taking any responsibility for the safety of their participants. They were just saying, hey, you're fully responsible. You know, if you get triggered or traumatized, that's on you, where they're actually not leading a safe container. And so, you know, and their methodologies were sometimes re-traumatizing, and they wouldn't let people leave, and they wouldn't encourage people to go take care of themselves. And so that's kind of where it gets a little muddy and dangerous. And then as a young person, you don't really know what's going on. You're just trusting that you're in good hands. These people are trained, they know what they're doing. And so there can kind of be this blind faith when you go into these containers. And so I think that's where maybe asking more questions, or interviewing the teachers, and just be like, what is your training? You know, for me, I will not step in a container, medicine or otherwise, where the facilitator is not trauma informed. I just won't.
What does that mean, trauma informed?
Yeah, I think it's at least the baseline basis is that you're not going to be re-traumatized in this container. Hopefully, you know, we can't guarantee that, but hopefully they know enough about the nervous system, and also how to spot trauma when it is happening, or when somebody is dysregulated, and they can spot it, and at least kind of encourage that person to come back to a regulated state and go, you know, and even just encouraging someone to take care of their needs is trauma informed, you know, allowing them to have sovereign choice of, yes, I want to participate in this, or no, actually it's not right for me. So it can get much more nuanced than that. And it's, you know, a whole broader topic of creating safer spaces. Maybe we're not always safe, but we can be safer. I
mean, the ultimate safety in what you were saying is going slow enough that you know what you're really a yes for. And that, you know, particularly if you've grown up in an environment where you never say no to teacher, you know, yeah, you can just like drop in and go, I'm a yes or I'm a no. Like if you're there already and you know it's a sexualized container, there's some part of you that's looking for instruction in that, but also like part of it's got to be like teaching true consent, right? I know what I want. I mean, I know people who are 60 years old who can't tell you what their body wants. So own their desire. So I think that's where you get a lot of messy things. Like if I can't own my desire as a woman, then I feel desire, and then someone else accompanies me in exploring that, but I've sort of hidden my true desire from my own self, then I might blame them. You know what I'm saying? And there are entire schools of thought on things like women who can only get aroused when they're being dominated because it takes away their agency. And without agency, then they don't have shame around their choice. So this all seems to point to like somatic resting, you know?
Yeah. And I think it's a question for everyone. You know, I do feel like having some kind of somatic training or background or coach or therapist is important when you're going into these neo-tantra spaces, because like you said, a lot of women aren't able to spot their own yeses and nos, or maybe they don't know their own trauma story. They don't know they've been traumatized. Trauma can be very latent. And so sometimes when they get in these group spaces, all their trauma comes up and they don't know what's going on. And so if there's not someone there to really spot it and go, wow, actually, this practice isn't right for you, I'm going to advocate for your safety. Like, I'm going to ask you to not participate because that person might not have agency. So I think it's also important, you know, as a guide to be like, actually, you know, something's kind of up in my system that I actually don't feel good, you know, for you. And not that we need to always say that our responsibility is in somebody else's hands, but I think we're in this co-relationship, right? We're always co-creating an experience. And so I think if you're more quote unquote well-trained than someone, and you are holding the container, you can, and I think should be, an advocate for their safety and their well-being.
What do you look for in a space? What are the signs that someone's checked out or over their limit?
Yeah, there can kind of be a dissociation. They can blank out. They can be a little checked out, a little floaty. I mean, it can be as obvious as shaking and crying and going, oh my gosh, I'm just they can be completely overwhelmed. So yeah, it's important to look for looking at their face. If they're looking down a lot, they're not making eye contact, they're not at ease, you know, they can see them maybe tensing up or contracting. So yeah, it's kind of a fine line between cathartic release tears and, you know, tears that they're being re-traumatized. And so it is a fine line. And I think as a teacher, you know, I've also heard stories in this institute where the teacher would come over and there'd be a woman totally traumatized crying, and she'd be like, keep going, go deeper, as opposed to, hey, you know, we can actually stop. Like, we don't have to keep going. And I think, you know, even in our Western culture, there's so much conditioning around pushing through and keep going and persevere. And I think it's so crucial in our society and repatterning to give people permission to stop.
So now you're in your body, you're loving yourself, you have permission to have a yes or no, and you're really diving into like, what do you actually want in your sexualized embodiment? You work with men also a lot, don't you? So I think a lot of times as women, we think men sexually don't have a lot of the same hang-ups or concerns. But I bet you have a different opinion because of that expression on your face. What do men come to you with?
Oh man, so men have the most tender hearts, and they have developmental trauma, they have fears, they have religious shame, they have religious conditioning, they have anxiety around sex, you know, they have performance anxiety, you know, am I enough? Am I doing enough? They're usually in their heads and not in their bodies.
But even just to sit there slowly, like with a guide, and sit there slowly and learn how to talk about it. And here's what feels good and here's what doesn't. That must be pretty magical. So when you're working with people, do you act as a stand-in in that interaction? Or do you coach couples? How do you even go about like bringing someone into this really vulnerable space?
I don't really work as a stand-in, but I do work primarily one-on-one with men or women. And we're really just finding the places in the body that are holding that shame or holding the blockage. And we're just doing a lot of body talk. Hey, where is it? What's going on? What is that voice? You know, what is it needing? What is it not getting? And usually it's like, what did you not get from your mother? it's usually the sexual block is, my mother didn't love me unconditionally. And so there's this, they've been performative their entire lives in order to get feminine love. And so it's really this reverse of how do they resource their own feminine love. So they're not totally, trying to get it subconsciously from their partners.
We have this beautiful picture of a man like doing what you talked about in the beginning, laying out, feeling his whole body, and then like inviting feminine love to enter him unconditionally, and just like kind of beautiful. Ah! So let's talk about play. How do you cultivate play in your day-to-day life?
Well, I'm really lucky to live in Puna in Hawaii, where I have a lot of opportunities for play. And right now I'm really blessed that there's this little girl staying on property, and she's 6 years old, and we get to just go walk around and pick flowers and play make-believe. And so she really gets me out of my head and into this sense of wonderment. I have little kitties around me, animals, but also the beach is just this. I went before this interview to just kind of center and recharge. And there's just something so freeing about being naked on the beach and in the sunshine and feeling the sand on me. And, sometimes there's dolphins. And so that kind of sparks this, super playful, energy. And then, there's ecstatic dance here. I mean, there's every opportunity here to just kind of shake it off or walk it off, or just kind of be in the sense of wonderment as opposed to in this constant to-do list reality.
I love the idea that you said play, like you're playing with the ocean. Playing with all of nature and all of the life forms and life forces that surround us. That's a pretty good attitude. Since you mentioned that you really value training and understand what people's lineages are, can you talk a little bit about the people who've had the biggest influence on you?
Yeah. So my late teacher, Psalm Isadora, was part of the Shakta Tantra Sri Vidya lineage path, and her guru, Sri Amritananda, who is also ascended. But it's this beautiful goddess worshipping path, and he founded this ashram in India called Devi Puram, and it's still somewhat functional, so you can go to devipuram.com. But she was just this wild Kali force, and she was fearless and vibrant and super charismatic and extremely intelligent. And I feel like I just got on what we called the Psalm train, and then I just never wanted to get off. But then eventually she left her body, and then it was like, okay, it's time for you to hold this energy, and I can't hold it, for everyone all the time. And she was a massive teacher on kind of the fire path, and tons of breath work and tons of strong yoga and tons of, burning through samskaras and awakening the Kundalini Shakti in the body. So this was a very Shaktifying path. It was very heating, and it was very invigorating. So there was a lot of amplification of energy. And then I also was studying with Paul Muller-Ortega, and he's the Shiva path, and it's very still, and it's very meditative, and it's very cooling, and his methodology was very simple. It's like we just sat and we said our internal mantra, and that was pretty much it. He didn't want to complicate things, but the way that he spoke about divinity and the tantric path is a transmission in and of itself. So if you ever have a chance to listen to one of his talks or sit with him before he passes on, definitely do it. And then I got the chance to deepen with Christopher Wallis, or Harish, and I just absolutely love and appreciate him so much, because he just gives everything he knows to anybody who wants to learn it. And he's written Tantra Illuminated. He has transcribed Recognition Sutras, which is a massive body of work. And so if you want to learn Tantra, you can learn Tantra, and he will he just generously gives things that are even secret tantras and hidden tantras and things that aren't supposed to be shared. And so he kind of, I think, broke off from Paul Muller-Ortega in the sense that he's like, no, I'm just going to give these teachings super freely. And it's very beautiful. And it's also beautiful to have a safe and sane, grounded voice in classical Tantra that's like, no, this is what Tantra is, and I'm going to hold to tradition. And I do appreciate him for that. So he is keeping the lineage really pure. And so I really appreciate that. And then Layla Martin is my somatic psychology teacher who also had training in neo-tantra and classical tantra and then somatic psychology, and she sort of blended it all together. She just did this big old soup. And so it was a totally different kind of transmission that I can only describe as, in my chakra systems, was like a lily flower opening up and just blossoming in like this super sweet, soft, nourishing way that just felt like the mother's love coming inside of me and loving me up in every cell.
This like feeling of sacred body, you know, like the whole thing combines to make a new school of thought. Did you know that Harish lived in my house?
No.
Yeah, 10 years ago, he was in the lower level apartment in my house. And for a long time, actually, he was, I guess he was like my roommate. But you're right, he's like a scholar practitioner. And he was writing Tantra Illuminated. So I have some of the pre-bound draft copies of that. It was such an honor because he was teaching an immersion program in San Francisco in the Heart of Recognition. It was a year-long program. And it was a powerful group. It was like Mark Morford, and I think that was the whole time when the Janet Stone, Sienna, that whole Kula was like alive. And then Christopher Tompkins moved in. And so Tompkins is also an independent Sanskrit scholar. And both of them were such sweet nerd outs. And one time I'm sitting upstairs and I hear this shriek from the basement, like eureka kind of a thing. And Christopher Tompkins comes upstairs and he goes, I found it. He had scanned 13,000 untranslated texts from the old Sanskrit in a Muslim controlled library in the north that had never been translated. And he found the original vinyasa flow. And he was just about it. He like came upstairs and he ended up teaching courses on that with Shiva Ray and like really developed a course out of it. But that work is accurate and highly technical. Like it's a path you could study for 15, 20, 30, like a lifelong path. So if you're out there and this is exciting you, Christopher Wallis website, like his stuff is 8,000 word explanations. But if you just want to begin with making your life better, you know, like feeling better in your body, being more connected to others, being more connected to yourself, then I think we have some good places to start. Do you want to give them a rundown, a little prescription of where to start if you're just beginning on a tantric path, or what we're going to call sacred body path?
That's a great inquiry, and I'm sure there are people all around the world who are amazing. So I think there is something to be said about asking your friends, like, who did you study with? Who do you like? Who's in the area? And kind of seeing, you know, there's something about praying for your teacher. Oh, yeah. It's like just because my teacher touched me in a certain way doesn't mean they're going to touch you in the same way. So I think there's something about really praying for your teacher and divinely kind of aligning with them.
To come in.
Yeah.
To be I'm ready.
Yep, like I'm ready for, you know, this big kahuna, so to speak.
I'm ready for the transmission, bring it.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how Psalm came in. And I mean, Layla Martin wasn't even really on my radar when I enrolled in her stuff. And I enrolled in a year-long program with her without ever having done a mini program. Yeah, I just dove in. I just knew. I felt resonance and I knew it was my next step. And so I think there's something about right timing. But then there's also programs I've enrolled in and I never finished. They didn't touch me. I got bored. I checked out, you know, so there's something about right timing. And, you know, Peter Levine has a huge body of work. So I think somatic experiencing is a beautiful body of work. And going on his website, seeing who his practitioners are, I'm sure there's a plethora of epic teachers, and I have a whole cohort in my graduating class that I think are totally amazing women. Layla Martin only certifies women right now, which maybe she'll open it up to men as well. There's embodied philosophy, and there's probably so many more that I'm not recalling right now.
So you are recommending, like, find a teacher. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And do people study with you? Are you teaching currently or serving clients? Mm-hmm. How are they working with you?
Yeah, I primarily work one-on-one. That's where my magic shines the most. And, occasionally I'll do a workshop here and there, and, have this story that I've been recovering from illness for so long. And I finally seeing kind of the light of day. So that's easier to hold group spaces, if I'm at capacity, in my fullest capacity. Yeah, I also work with men on the king archetype. And so the way that I view the king archetype and why it's so important is because it really does anchor the divine masculine energy into the body and into the psyche and into his habit energy, but it's also the master witness that can hold all the other parts. So it's the master organizer. It holds the inner child or the inner he's kind of the disciplinarian of all the parts, but he's also this unconditional source of love that is kind of the master healer as well. So if we think of Jesus as the ultimate king archetype, it's like, yeah, we can invoke a little more Jesus energy into our lives, that fully embodied divinity, kind of erect, divinity, but also with a full open heart.
I wish all of you more Jesuses. I think I want to go to like a blessing, basically. Like, there's a decision point you get to in your life when you say, I really want to be alive. I really choose this body and this life, and to try to unwind whatever is stopping me from experiencing it fully. And that seems to be a moment of grace. It's not even like you're actively choosing. It's like something has finally penetrated from the veil and has called you to itself. Like everything that one dives into, Tantra is an immense field. Here are a few takeaways and things that you can practice coming off the interview with Lauren. The first is self-responsibility for your experience. So learning to go slow enough that you actually can feel your true yes or your no in any given moment. And remember, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. The maybes go into the no category until they become a yes. A second one was sitting with the self and doing training. Corollary to that was asking for your teacher to appear. Basically, nothing takes the place of doing the work of learning how to sit with yourself and practice these skills. They really do prepare you for optimal engagement with others in the world. And this idea of asking and inviting your teacher, or the body of knowledge that'll meet you right where you are, to show up at the right moment. A third thing to practice is dropping the perfectionism, knowing that you might mess up. You probably will mess up. We all mess up, but that you're resilient and you can bounce back from whatever happens. And then cultivating playfulness. So I wanted to give you a few quotes from some of the teachers that Lauren mentioned. And the first one is Psalm Isadora. Psalm has an incredible story, by the way, of growing up in a Christian cult with significant body shaming, childhood sexual abuse, and then reacting to that by becoming incredibly sexual and addicted, and then having an enlightenment experience where she realized that all of these things had perfectly set her up to be a liberator. So Psalm teaches out of a deep recovery from a background that said her body wasn't healthy, whole, beauty, juicy, wonderful, and something to be celebrated. She says things like, true empowerment comes from embracing your own sensuality and owning your desires. The key to true intimacy is vulnerability. Open yourself up and let love flow. And your sexuality is a powerful force if you learn to harness it and use it to create a life filled with passion and joy. Really expand your capacities there. She has so many other good teachings and has been the subject of many podcast interviews and stuff prior to her death in 2017. She also mentions Christopher Wallis, who we talked about, also known as Harish. He's recently done a beautiful translation of a book called The Recognition Sutras, illuminating a 1,000-year-old spiritual masterpiece. And in there he writes, "We must thoroughly let go our resistance to what we don't like to see the beauty in. Resistance is nothing but commitment to your conditioning. If you want wonder, beauty, and joy to become the leitmotifs of your life, you must become willing to allow the experience, whatever it is, to totally dissolve into the silent presence that you truly are." Another teacher she mentioned, Paul Muller-Ortega, who is a meditation, philosophy, and spirituality person in the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, just like Christopher Wallis. He says we are each ultimately responsible for our own path, our own practice, our own sadhana. That just means practice, by the way. How do you go about making wisdom and knowledge your own? Unless it's illuminated in your own heart, you don't actually know it. Knowledge must be awakened by direct inner experience. I think that's such a beautiful reflection on what Tantra is overall. Your direct knowing, your direct experience with life itself. So have a wonderful day, evening, whatever, experiencing the fullness and beauty of this life in a body with all of your senses. Maybe you can unwind one little tiny imprisonment story of preference, story of resistance, and find a little bit more sparkle today. All right, if you like this episode, please share it. It really helps when we get the word out. It helps the people who come on and invest their time as guests. So make it worth their while, my friends, and give a shout out to these people on social media. And know that you can always find me at the.rose.woman on Instagram, or my company at Rosebud Woman, making gorgeous intimate care and ingestible wellness products for all the ages and stages of a woman's life.